Alright guys, so we are witnessing a total meltdown in the Eurozone. Everything, and I mean literally everything, is breaking down. We have economic chaos literally spreading on the streets. You have farmers protesting outside Brussels, spraying the entire area with a curious brown substance. And it's happening near the EU HQ. That's just insane. It's one big mess. Then we have Germany's property sector looking really risky at the moment. Of the entire Eurozone, German banks are at risk of a big crisis if real estate continues to crash down. Not only is there an industrial collapse, but their banking sector is one big time bomb just looking to explode. And of course, we must talk about Macron's epic Russian meltdown. Macron might be thinking of sending troops into Ukraine, maybe as a last resort plan. Even Germany is scolding Macron, telling him that it's a crazy idea and for Paris to just supply more weapons. So you can see the amount of desperation in Europe. The leaders there, they've lost control. All the crazy decisions have reached the breaking point, and let's talk about the farmers' protests first because things are really getting ugly. The farmers' protests are really simple to understand. All the crazy green policies, plus the preferential treatment to overseas suppliers, are sparking a wave of anger from the EU farmers. Their produce is being sold too cheaply, and there's unfair competition from abroad. And this is what happens when you have too many free trade agreements stacked on top of crazy environmental policies. Just these two are detrimental to farmers, reducing fertilizers by at least 20% and slashing pesticide use by 50%, which is crazy considering we are still in a global food crisis. You know why inflation is so high? It's not just the money printing going on, it's also because the supply of food isn't growing fast enough. Fertilizers literally double the amount of food production. If you reduce the use of fertilizers in addition to pesticides, you will just destroy the output of local farmers. You directly affect crop growth. Farmers throughout the EU, they use pesticides to protect their harvest. From the Netherlands to France and Germany, if you cut away pesticide use by 50%, you will destroy production even further. So these policies are stacked against the farmers. It lowers their output and by extension, it lowers their revenues as well. And the last thing you want to do is to make the farmers angry. It's as if the people on top, they're forgetting who really runs the country. It's the farmers, it's the truckers and the blue collar workers. And now the bureaucrats are getting a wake up call. Consider this, farms in the EU are really starting to die off. In 2020, there were only 9.1 million farms. That's 5.3 million fewer farms than in 2005. That's a huge decline of 37%. Food production in the EU is also starting to fall across the board. By 2035, cow herds in the EU will decrease by 10%. Meat production will also drop by 1% a year all the way until 2035. We are witnessing a collapse in food production. So you can understand why the farmers are just so angry. They are producing less and selling less because of the climate policies from the EU. And this is where things get crazier. Because of Russia-Ukraine, the EU removes tariffs on food coming in from Ukraine. And don't forget that Ukraine is a big breadbasket of the world. Apart from Russia, Ukraine produces a ton of food like wheat, corn, and barley. It's so obvious what will happen. It will flood the country and cause a big oversupply crisis. Just look at Poland's situation. Before the war, virtually nothing came through from Ukraine. Then from June 2022, we see this big tsunami of grain just sweep across Poland. It went from almost zero to nearly 200,000 tons a month. That's a crazy increase in supply that just destroyed the margins of Polish farmers. So just imagine if the Poles didn't ban further exports from Ukraine, their farmers would be decimated. But yet it's not enough. Farmers in Poland, they are still very angry. The effects of the war are now hitting them and they are protesting. They are going to keep protesting on the roads and blockade the border crossing. And this is going on everywhere in Germany, in Brussels, in France. Farmers realize that they are being shortchanged back home, and the longer this war continues, they will get grinded down even further. Together with deindustrialization, high inflation, and the constant aid to Ukraine, this could literally tear Europe apart. Just look at the pictures. You can see demonstrators out in the thousands blocking access to everything. Tractors are blockading the roads in Poland, and it's also happening in France as well. French police are standing off against farmers in tractors. It's a complete mess in the EU. So you can sense the level of panic happening in Brussels. You can't keep shuffling $50 billion to Ukraine and then forget about your own farmers. That doesn't work. They're the last people on planet Earth you want to piss off. There are even pro-Putin slogans in the farmers' protests, and they are blaming it on the Russian agents. Now, I don't know about you, but it wasn't Russia that started these crazy climate policies 5 to 10 years back. And to solve this mess, Europe has no choice but to spend even more money when they are broke. EU leaders are telling Brussels to increase funding and subsidies for their farmers. The cap fund stands at around $60 billion a year, and that might sound a lot like Brussels is doing a ton for the farmers, but that still isn't enough. Because the EU won't ban grain from Ukraine or stop the war, the only route left is to ramp up spending. And that, of course, means getting to further debt at a time when rates are very high. But if they don't, the far right parties are going to win. Le Pen and the AFD are going to steamroll the elections. The EU will likely need to follow China's example and provide a lot more subsidies and support. Just look at the disparity here. China provides their farmers with support equivalent to 1.7% of their GDP, almost 3 times the support versus the EU. The Chinese understands the importance of a strong agricultural base. So things are looking really bad here. There's only one solution left, and that is to spend a whole lot more money to placate the farmers. Because if they don't, EU farm production will collapse and move to places like Argentina and Brazil. It's simply a big disaster. But the crisis goes beyond just agriculture. Germany has a big property crisis brewing. We think that it's just a US problem, right? It's America's problem, but that's not the case. Europe is in big trouble as well. Just recall what happened back in March last year. We had major US banks like SVB become insolvent and collapse. Well, German banks might be next on the chopping block. Germany's slow motion property crash is a looming risk for their banks. German banks have managed to hide the problem on their balance sheet, but they can't do it forever. If more forced sales happen, then German banks will have to face a reckoning. They can't hide behind the numbers any longer. Now, the issue with Germany is a different set of accounting rules and adjustments, and this allows their banks to avoid taking immediate hits when property prices fall. Unlike the US, which has to do mark to market accounting, US banks need to value their loans at the market price, whatever amount of money they can sell their real estate loans right now. So if commercial real estate collapses, US banks they have no choice but to reflect the losses on their books. But German banks work under a very weird assumption that investors and borrowers don't sell in a falling market, so the losses can sit silently on the books. Obviously, this is very risky because the mess can pile up without anyone knowing. It's like a silent time bomb that can explode at any moment, any time, because the books are just so obscure. European borrowers are paying up to 6% rates on their loans. That's double the amount in 2022. So just imagine the risk of default as property prices continue to crash. The longer rates stay high, the higher the odds of a default. It's a simple equation here. But that's not the dangerous part, right? It goes deeper than that. There's a reason why German banks are horribly exposed, and it's because they are cowboy lenders. They have loose lending standards. The banks offered loans worth up to 80% of a building's value. So if a building was priced at, say, $100 million, a German bank might lend a borrower $80 million to build it. That's much more than any other place in Europe. They are increasing their risk for a bigger payout, but that only works during the good times. Where the bad times roll in is a disaster. If a default happens, German banks will have the most to lose. They'll be thrown back the loan and a building that can't be sold, and the losses could be very tremendous. Now, you would think that a 2 to 3% rise in interest rates isn't much, but it can absolutely wreck the value of a commercial property. CRE is all about income generation. As government bonds yield more, investors will value commercial properties less. Because the rental doesn't move or even drops, the value of the entire building will collapse down as well. And let's use a commercial building in Berlin for example. The property generates $10 million of rental income, and let's use that as a baseline. Back in 2022, yields were at 2.4%, and that values the building at 416 million. So a German bank could come in and lend 80% of that, or around $330 million. Just 18 months later, yields have risen to 4.4% because of competition from government bonds. And this made the value of the building crash down to 227 million. That's a big 40% drop. If a default happens, the bank will be stuck with an asset worth 220 million when their loan amount was 330 million. That's a crazy loss of $110 million. They are effectively down by 33%. That will be a realized loss. And when it comes to banking loans, there is a metric called bad loans ratio. That's the percentage of loans that aren't paying interest or they are on the brink of default. In Germany's case, this metric is starting to rise from 2% to nearly 3.5%. This is a disturbing trend that shows the risk starting to build in German banks. The longer interest rates stay high, the bigger the odds of a banking crisis coming. It's not looking good for Germany today. But even that disaster is nothing compared to what Macron did 2 days back. The idea of putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, and we must talk about this. During a news conference, Macron of course told the world that nothing should be ruled out, and we will do anything we can to prevent Russia from winning this war. And this is by far the biggest threat that could push this conflict into a full regional or even a global war. And we know it's Macron talking, and he tends to make a lot of bizarre statements, but this highlights more or less the discussions already happening within the EU itself, which should be very disturbing, very frightening. Now, I want to highlight one part of his speech that's very alarming as well. It is about how Western support always seems to step up. It's riding the escalation escalator and there's no reverse gear. And guess what? He's absolutely right on that aspect. The people that said never ever today were the same ones who said never ever planes, never ever long range missiles, and never ever trucks. They all said that 2 years ago. Remember the state of affairs. We have gone from helmets and sleeping bags to drones to Storm Shadow missiles and even Challenger tanks. The level of support is becoming breathtaking. It's becoming more lethal with each passing month. So sending in NATO troops today isn't really that impossible. It's probably a coin flip at this point. Now, of course, the US and other EU members are rebuking this. They don't want to send in the troops, not when everything is against them. They can't produce enough ammunition, and just imagine the financial cost of such a campaign. The Russians are also having a field day with this. The Russian State Duma reminded France of the horrific 1812 invasion of Russia that just decimated the French army. Before making such statements, Macron would do well to remember how it ended for Napoleon and his soldiers, more than 600,000 of whom were left lying in the damp earth. And this is by far absolute humiliation to France. We know Macron wants to embrace a war economy, but sending troops in today is just calling for World War III. The problem France is facing is a big credibility gap. Even within the EU, few members really take Macron seriously. All these blustering statements sound grand, but if we look at the actual aid commitments to Ukraine, France has actually given very little. The US has provided over $67 billion. Germany has pledged at least $22 billion, but France is less than $2 billion in. Even from the perspective of the EU, it's very hard to take France seriously. It's just like a backseat driver telling you where to go. Even if France sends in the troops, supplying them is another problem. It's a whole different matter. If the collective might of the West can't provide Ukraine with enough ammunition, sending in waves of soldiers today won't make a difference, and they are beginning to realize this. Europe is now looking abroad to buy weapons for Ukraine. Macron, in particular, is keen to buy ammunition from non-EU countries to give Ukraine. Russia winning on the field is starting to spark panic, and now NATO, the EU, they are all pulling out the stops. Obviously, some weapons will come from the US, but it won't be enough. Will it come from other G7 allies, maybe Japan, maybe South Korea? We have no idea. But if this happens, the war economy will start to spread across the world. The battle against Russia is going to escalate, and very soon, it's going to spread beyond NATO and the West. So it's absolute chaos in Europe today. The economy is in trouble, and this mess goes beyond just manufacturing, beyond just their industries. The Russia-Ukraine conflict simply exposed the underlying rot. The green policies are backfiring, EU banks are taking on big risks, and the shift to a war economy is failing as well. And if things continue to go down this road, the EU economy will continue to slump and any recovery will take much longer. And hopefully they won't put boots on the ground or the war will escalate out of control. It might be World War III. But let me know what you think. How bad are the farmers' protests? And is Macron giving us a clue? Or is he just talking nonsense once again? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.